And we might also realize that this is simply the way we have to solve our problems, and would give the politicians themselves a little more room to operate. I'll say this just quickly because of the election. If we talk a lot about leadership in this country, and rightly, we do not talk much about followership. Politicians, if we really wanted to hear the truth, guess what? They would be telling it. You know, there is a sense that we'll see whether or not this is true with Governor Christie. You know, people who come out and the truth tellers and they tell people where to get off. It is, as Churchill said in a different context, a wonderful starter, but it's not a very good finisher. And if it's going to be a good finisher, then people like us have to be willing to make what Jefferson called mutual concessions. As he said, you know, it is best in a system as ours to is best in a system like ours to give as well as to take. And so in that way, I think Jefferson's a kind of architect of a broad American middle, at least of a habit of mind and of heart that suggests that compromise is not a dirty word. The middle way is not always the right way, but it often is. And we're having a hard enough time, we've always had a hard time trying to get through it. So hard, in fact, that let's take a few minutes and go back to that great moment of Edenic bipartisanship, the Washington Cabinet. Here is George Washington writing his Secretary of State about the relations with the Secretary of the Treasury. How unfortunate that whilst we are encompassed on all sides with avowed enemies and insidious friends, that internal dissensions should be harrowing and tearing our vitals. That's very un-Washington, harrowing and tearing our vitals. Jefferson said of himself and Hamilton that we were daily pitted in the cabinet like two cocks. John Adams said of Jefferson, his mind is now poisoned with passion, prejudice, and faction. It was all happiness and frock coats back there. Here's Jefferson on Hamilton. This is one of my favorite lines in the whole canon. I will not suffer the slanders of a man whose history, from the moment at which history can stoop to notice him, is a tissue of machinations against the liberty of the country which has not only received him and given him bread, but heaped its honors on his head. Paging Warren Redmond. Alexander Hamilton of Jefferson said that his presidency would mean that we had an atheist in religion and a fanatic in politics assuming the helm of state. And in a fine piece of political correspondence, an anonymous letter writer wrote Jefferson in these years, I think you ought to get a damn kicking, you red-headed son of a bitch. As it says in Ecclesiastes, and Jefferson never got to the point of cutting that one up, gotta like a guy who can edit the big guy. I yield to few people in my editorial ego, but man, hats off to you on that. There is no thing new under the sun. Things are different in degree, not in kind. And what Jefferson was facing was what he called it, a bold and doubtful election between submission and the sword. So I think we have to go back and put ourselves in those shoes for a moment to realize the nature and the extent of the existential crisis that Jefferson believed he was facing. Part of my argument in this book is that the whole period makes the most sense when we think of the era from 1763 until 1815 as a 50-year war with Britain. Sometimes hot, sometimes cold, but always there. A very rough analogy is with the Cold War with the Soviets from Truman to George H.W. Bush. Sometimes we fought with guns, sometimes we fought with ideas, but every political event was interpreted and only made sense to contemporaries in the context of that larger struggle. Jefferson never stopped fighting Britain. And if you don't, it seems to me that if we don't look at it that way, the 1790s kind of comes out of nowhere. You know, in the march of time, Lowell Thomas kind of way in our heads, everybody's at Philadelphia, then there's something about crossing the Delaware, then Jefferson is president, and we're all Federalists and we're all Republicans, and we're off to Lincoln at that point at the movies. The 1790s don't, suddenly, even in that zone, even in that way of thinking, you end up with this ferociously partisan atmosphere that seems to come out of nowhere. Where does that come from? Where did the daily pitted in the cabinet like two cocks? Where did that ethos come from? I think it came from the fundamental disagreement about whether Britain was coming back. Jefferson thought they were coming back, and guess what? They did. It's an easy argument to win. Those are the kind we like. They did come back. And so, was he overly paranoid? Was he too conspiratorial? Yes. He drove, poor George Washington was driven crazy by this, and had to say they're not above 2 or 3 men in America who believe as you believe that Britain is going to re-enter the American culture and try to refight the revolution. But conspiracy, as Gordon Wood and others have so brilliantly written, conspiracy was even more a part of their world than it is of ours, and it's a pretty big part of ours. And they didn't even have the internet. This was just honest, town square stuff. So I think if we see it that way, if we see Jefferson in a very unlikely pose, I would urge you to think about him as a warrior. He was a cold warrior, but he was a warrior. And he was fighting with ideas, and he was fighting domestic politics in order to secure the revolution. He saw the revolution as an extension of himself. It was an organic thing. It was something that he had to tend to. He saw it in mythic terms almost immediately. Almost immediately. Said to Adams, we're the Argonauts. He looked forward to the moment when they would be, after they died and they went wherever they go, they would be in ancient Congress watching how their successors were managing this precious thing they had left them. And I think that that's an important way of understanding, and it's important to understand that that's how Jefferson saw the world. It was full of strife, fraught with danger. America was worth protecting at any cost, as long as America still meant, in his mind, the survival and success of Republican liberty. And partisanship itself, though he had dreams of abolishing it, by the middle of his presidency, he'd pretty much given that up and come to believe, I think, that partisan strife was simply part of the oxygen of democracy. There are the wonderful, Jefferson, as you all know, is like Churchill and the Bible. You can quote him wonderfully on each side of every question. The pillow, you can have, actually, I wanted to suggest this to Leslie, that the needlepoint pillows in the shop, you do one side here and one side there, and just move it around. But I do think that, by and large, by the middle of his term, he had decided that partisanship itself was going to endure. Of course, he blamed the other side. He said the Federalists had been so ferociously against him when he first came in. No man, he said, ever faced such a situation as I when they were trying to undo the election of 1801. But he still moved beyond that and knew that partisanship would be a central issue. So the question becomes, what do you do in a partisan atmosphere? Because I do believe Thomas Jefferson fundamentally was a pragmatist. If he hadn't been, again, I think he would have just come back here and thought big thoughts and written letters. He didn't. He always went back into the arena, was drawn to it. So how do you do that? What was his sense, his set of survival skills that led him to become, I think, the most powerful figure, certainly in the first third of American history? From 1800 to 1840, for 36 of those years, either Thomas Jefferson or a self-described Jeffersonian was president of the United States. It's a dynasty, however informal, without parallel. Lincoln didn't do it, FDR didn't do it, Reagan didn't do it. I mean, it's an extraordinary achievement. As late as Martin Van Buren running as I'm a Jeffersonian, I'm going to restore this code. So what was it about this? What was in the style? What was in the ethos that was that worked so well? And I think there are 4 things, and I just want to run through them quickly. One is that Jefferson was, despite his occasional, or the failure to speak very loudly, his essential good grace, was a daring man politically. He understood that time was always short, that political capital did not keep, and that you had to move with some dispatch in a popular way, in a political way. I think that he really learned that lesson after the very disturbing governorship of Virginia, that he had, in his own mind, he had made a series of decisions that made sense then, but which he regretted because they didn't work out. And he would never again be caught napping, essentially. And I think there's a direct line, biographically, between the failures of the governorship here and the fact that the British rode up here and came up the hill, and the way in which he handled Louisiana in the presidency. Because, as you'll remember, and this gets us to the second thing, if he was always daring, he was always willing to seize opportunities, he was always willing to depart from dogma to do it. I don't think it's too much to say that Jefferson was a master at using Hamiltonian means to achieve Jeffersonian ends, as only he could do. So he would depart from dogma. And Louisiana is the great example.